Hello and welcome. My name is Alan and today we're back with more The Massacre at El Mozote. We'll be picking up with Chapter 5, La Matanza. It was growing dark that Thursday afternoon when the men of the Atlacatl trudged into El Mozote. They found the streets deserted. For the last 2 days, the thud of mortars, the firecracker staccato of small arm fires, and the roar of the aircraft had been coming steadily closer. And that morning, helicopters and planes of the Salvadoran Air Force had strafed and bombed the area around the hamlet, terrifying the inhabitants. Everything was closer every day, louder every day, Rufina Amaya told me, and finally, by that day, the people were hiding in their houses. The strafing ceased not long before the men of the Atlacatl entered the hamlet, dragging with them civilians they had found hiding along the way. Tired and impatient, the soldiers swarmed about the houses of El Mozote and pounded on the doors with the butts of their M16s. "Sagan!" they shouted angrily. "Get out here! Get out here now!" Hesitantly, the people came out into the twilight, frightened, bewildered, unsure of what was happening. The soldiers, cursing and yelling, pulled them forward, hustled them along with the butts of their rifles, herded everyone into the center of the street. Rufina and her husband, Domingo Claros, emerged with their 4 children. He was carrying 3-year-old Marta Lilian and leading Cristino, 9-year-old, while Rufina had 5-year-old Maria Dolores by the hand and carried at her breast Maria Isabel, 8 months old. They told us all to lie down in the street, boca abajo, literally, mouth down. And they began pushing some of us down, Rufina says. As my husband was setting the little girl down, a soldier pushed him to the ground. The girl started to cry. By then, all the children were crying. The entire town lay like that, perhaps 400 people face down in the dirt as darkness fell. Between the wailing of at least 100 children and the shouting of the soldiers, hundreds had entered the hamlet by now. The din must have been unbearable. The soldiers marched up and down the lines of people, kicking one here and there, striking another with the rifle butt, and all the while keeping up a steady rain of shouted insults and demands. As Rufina tells it, a soldier would stop next to a man or a woman, kick the prone body, and bark out a question. Who were the guerrillas? Where were they? Where did they hide their guns? The men and women of El Mozote insisted that there were no guerrillas there, and they knew nothing of guerrillas or weapons If you want to find gorillas, one woman shouted fearfully, raising her hand from the ground, go out there. She waved toward the hills, outside town. But here were not gorillas. This only made the soldiers angrier. All you sons of bitches are collaborators, an officer said. If you're going to have to pay for those bastards. At one point, as Rufina tells it, the wealthy and influential Marco Diaz, lying in the street beside his wife and their sons and daughters, raised his head. Wait, he pleaded. They promised me nothing would happen to the people here. The officer told me so. At that, the Atlacatl officer laughed and said, no, motherfucker. You all have to pay. Now you get your face back in the ground. And he raised the black boot and pushed Marcos Diaz's head down into the dirt. They were very abusive, Rufina says. We couldn't do anything. We had all these guns. They had all these guns. We had to obey. Some of the soldiers took down names as others went along the lines, demanding to see people's hands and pulling from the fingers any rings they saw, then ordering them to turn over their jewelry and crucifixes and anything else that might have some value. The people of El Mozote lay there, in the street, their faces in the dust. The children sobbing for a long time. The soldiers yelled, strode back and forth, aimed their weapons at them. We thought that they were going to kill us all. That we were sentenced to die right there, Rufina says. But finally the soldiers ordered them to get up. As the people of El Mozote climbed unsteadily to their feet, the soldiers barked out an order. They were to go back into their houses, the soldiers said, and not let even so much as their noses poke out the door. The people, terrified, grateful to be alive, hurried into their houses, crowded into them, and virtually every room in the hamlet held extra people. Now the wailing of children made the houses seem smaller still. No one slept. Outside, the men of the Atlacatl shouted and laughed and sang songs, punctuating the hilarity with celebratory bursts of gunfire. Rufina and her children, packed into a house with two other families, struggled to calm their children. They were hungry and we had no food to give them, she says. We were going to kill a chicken to feed them. But as soon as we lit a candle, the soldiers yelled at us from the street to put out the light. Our children were scared and hungry, and the littlest ones were messing all over themselves, and we couldn't even take them outside to clean them. So they huddled inside the darkness, listening anxiously to the laughter, starting up each time it was cut by a burst of automatic fire. And all the while trying to soothe the children. The saddest thing was that the children were crying and we could do nothing for them, Rufina says. Soon everything would be all right, their parents assured them. Soon they would be safe. Perhaps the parents began to believe it themselves after the terror of that evening After feeling the earth against their faces and the gun muzzles at their necks, Rufina and her husband prayed that they had seen the worst and the soldiers would leave the next day. We were thinking that because they hadn't killed as yet, maybe they wouldn't, Rufina says. After all, no one had really been harmed. And even if the promises of Marcos Diaz's officer friend had been worthless, well, the people here had never had trouble with the army. And the people knew that they weren't guerrillas. And the soldiers, despite their angry shouting, must know it too. As the people of El Mozote huddled in their dark houses down at Atlacatl, the base camp of operations south of Torola River, the officers were taking stock. The first stage of the operation, the convergence of the Atlacatl companies on El Mozote, the capture of the hamlet and its people, had gone well. The first phase was over. The lieutenant involved in the operation told me. All the unit commanders came to Atlacatl to talk it over. I was heading for the mess hall and I bumped into he named a major who at that time was a key figure in military intelligence. And he said to me, "Look, we might need you tomorrow. Be ready." Then the men gave the younger officer a rundown of the situation. He said, "You know, the first phase is over. The units have gone through and done what they've had to do, and now it's just a question of going in there and interrogating those people, you know, the POWs. I asked him if there had been any guerrillas there, and he said, no, they're gone, but we might need you tomorrow. We have people to interrogate. We have maybe 600 people altogether." That was a lot of people to interrogate. If I had gone in there, the officer had told me, I would have expected to spend 2 or 3 days, considering all the people they had. The two men stood there for 4 or 5 minutes while the major briefed the younger man on the sort of information they wanted to get out of the prisoners. Basically, we were looking for the guerrillas' means of support, how they were getting their food, and so on. We'd stopped a lot of their communications, but we wanted to know their logistics, how they were getting their supplies, what their routes were, and so on. Especially, we wanted to know who it was they'd infiltrated into the army itself, and who was selling them arms. We had evidence that there was considerable selling of arms from the army at that time. I mean, you could ask 3 or 4 times about a weapon, what a weapon was worth, and these people would pay it, and many of the soldiers couldn't resist that. There was selling of information as well. All our operations were being leaked. Everyone wanted to make a buck. That was the game. Other officers passed by as the two men talked. That the first phase had been completed, that the Atlacatl had seized El Mozote was now held its population prisoner, was much more widely known than the officers at Atlacatl that night. My impression was that the plan was to spend the next day interrogating these people, the lieutenant told me, and apparently that was the Major's impression as well. But the next day, he never called me. And by that night, everyone knew that something had happened. We'll end this episode here. So yeah. We're seeing they've went into the village of Mozote. And the first thing they do is they try to impress fear upon the citizens with the weapons. And then, you know, you have the soldiers acting like they're just burning off any stress they had by laughing, bursts of gunfire, singing. I mean, they might as well be pirates at that point. Have their guns and or their swords and sing, ha 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 ha, shiver me timbers. You know, that's kind of what it reminds me of. But they're supposed to be this big bad group, the Atlacatl. Because, you know, their weapons supplied and at least trained a little bit. But we can see, left to their own devices, they get much more rowdy. So yeah, we're seeing what is done to these poor people. And if they thought, you know, they were going to be spared, but suddenly things are not looking up. The major did not turn up. And I get the feeling we're about to see things go bad. Very bad. Like I said, as of right now, it's just threatening people. Intimidating. They got everybody out. Made them lay on the ground. They were striking them with the butts of the rifle. Sometimes would put the barrel to the back of the neck of one of these villagers lying down. You know, it's very much a fear tactic. And then they go and rob these people. Give us your jewelry, anything of value. Yeah. But based on what we know from the beginning of the book, the end tragedy, it's going to get a lot worse. But I'll end this episode here. As always, educate thyself. Think, read, study, learn. Someone tries to tell you something you have trouble believing, ask them to cite their sources. I'll see you all in the next video. Until then, later.